On a warm spring afternoon in 1999, the small town of Mill Haven carried the usual rhythms of a community where nothing much ever changed. Children biked along gravel roads, church bells echoed faintly from the town square, and the wide river that carved its way through the valley shimmered beneath the sunlight. That river, often the setting for lazy summer afternoons and childhood adventures, would soon become the focal point of a tragedy that fractured the town in ways no one could have predicted. 13-year-old Daniel Porter was one of those kids who never seemed to sit still, always chasing after something just out of reach. On that day, he and a handful of friends walked down the dirt trail toward the crossing, laughing, carrying backpacks filled with snacks and fishing gear. They told their parents they'd be back before dinner. None of them could have imagined what would unfold before the sun went down. The crossing itself was deceptively ordinary. A stretch of the river where the current slowed and the water thinned, shallow enough that generations of children had waded across it to reach the woods on the far side. To them, it wasn't dangerous, it was tradition. Local families called it the Kids' Bridge, a place where young people tested their courage against the moving water. Daniel, full of restless energy, was the first to step in that afternoon. According to his friends, he waded in confidently, teasing the others who hesitated at the bank. The water was cold, the stones slick underfoot, but he pressed forward, glancing back with a grin. Halfway across, one of the boys said, Daniel slipped slightly, caught himself, then carried on. They thought nothing of it. The river always demanded a little balance, but then something shifted. The boys behind him recalled seeing Daniel pause near the deeper middle channel. One claimed he heard Daniel call out, though he couldn't recall exactly what was said. Another insisted he saw him stumble again, this time losing his footing entirely. They described a brief moment of flailing arms, a splash, and then nothing. Just rippling water where he had been seconds before. Panic set in instantly. The group scattered, some shouting his name, others sprinting back toward town. By the time help arrived, there was no sign of Daniel anywhere. No thrashing, no struggling body pulled downstream, not even bubbles rising to the surface. It was as though the river had erased him completely. In a place like Mill Haven, where neighbors knew each other by name and everyone's business spread quickly, word of the disappearance raced through town faster than the current itself. Parents dropped everything, rushing to the banks, calling out desperately into the growing dusk. Local fishermen secured boats and combed the water with nets, convinced the boy had to be caught somewhere nearby. Even as the sun set, flashlights bobbed along the shoreline, cutting through the darkness, their beams illuminating. Only empty water and smooth stones. The more they searched, the more unsettling the silence became. A body should have surfaced. Someone should have spotted a shoe or a piece of clothing snagged in the reeds. Yet the river revealed nothing. By midnight, the sheriff had cordoned off the area, his voice hoarse from trying to maintain order among frantic families. Daniel's mother clutched at anyone who walked by, demanding answers, her face hollow with terror. His father stood back in silence, staring at the water as though sheer will might summon his son from beneath the surface. The other boys sat wrapped in blankets on the back of a pickup truck, their words tumbling over each other as deputies tried to make sense of their overlapping stories. Each detail only added to the confusion. Did he cry for help, or was he laughing? Did he fall into the current, or step forward willingly? Nothing aligned, and no explanation seemed to fully account for how a healthy 13-year-old could vanish so quickly in water so familiar. As dawn broke, the search intensified. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors churning the quiet morning air, while divers slipped into wetsuits and submerged into the river's depths. The current was steady but not overpowering, the water cloudy with sediment. They combed the bottom for hours, surfacing with nothing but exhaustion. On shore, volunteers dragged long poles through the reeds, hoping for any sign of clothing or remains. Dogs were brought in, sniffing along the muddy banks, tails wagging furiously before circling aimlessly. By evening, the sheriff made the announcement everyone dreaded but expected. Daniel Porter had not been found. Officially, he was declared a probable drowning victim. Yet, without a body, doubt lingered like smoke that refused to clear. For the people of Millhaven, the river crossing shifted overnight from a place of adventure to a symbol of fear. Parents forbade their children from going near it. Stories began to circulate about whirlpools that trapped the unlucky, about old sinkholes beneath the water's surface, about the river taking what it wanted and never giving it back. At school, Daniel's empty desk sat untouched for weeks, his classmates staring at the vacant chair with a mixture of sadness and unease. The teachers tried to maintain order, but the unspoken reality hung heavy in every room. Their friend had stepped into the river and simply never returned. That evening, as the town gathered for a candlelight vigil by the water's edge, the question echoed among the crowd. How could a boy vanish without leaving a trace? Some whispered about foul play, others clung to the belief that he was swept miles downstream and might still be found. But as the candles flickered against the current, the truth was impossible to ignore. For now, the river had claimed Daniel, and the mystery of where he had gone would haunt Millhaven for years to come. Within hours of Daniel Porter's disappearance, Millhaven transformed from a quiet river town into the center of a desperate rescue effort. By nightfall, floodlights lit the shoreline, their beams piercing into the dark water as teams worked in shifts, unwilling to let the river rest. Deputies called in resources from neighboring counties, and by morning, the operation had swelled far beyond what the town had ever witnessed. Helicopters circled above, their searchlights sweeping over the current, tracing every bend and backwater. Divers suited up and slipped beneath the surface, fighting low visibility and powerful undercurrents that churned up clouds of mud. They followed every contour of the riverbed, dragging their hands along submerged logs and jagged rocks, surfacing with nothing but silt clinging to their gloves. On land, volunteers fanned out across the banks, probing with long poles, peering into reeds and scouring miles downstream. Search dogs were brought in, their handlers urging them along the muddy trail where Daniel had last been seen. At moments, the dogs alerted, noses pointed toward the water, but every promising lead dissolved into nothing. For each hour that passed, the probability of finding a living child grew smaller. Still, his parents clung to the belief that he could be pulled out alive, dazed and hypothermic but breathing. They stood vigil on the banks, calling his name into the rushing current until their voices broke. By the second day, the sheriff's department widened the search perimeter, convinced the current could have carried Daniel much farther than expected. Boats launched in coordinated lines, methodically scanning eddies and deeper pools. At the dam downstream, crews waited with nets, convinced something had to surface. Yet the river gave them nothing, not a shoe tangled in the brush, not a piece of clothing caught on the rocks. The complete absence of evidence became more haunting than the sight of a body ever could have been. Millhaven's residents began whispering that the river had swallowed him whole, keeping its secret beneath the murky surface. As the third day dawned, exhaustion weighed heavily on the searchers. Divers rotated in and out of the water, their lips blue, their tanks clattering against the stones as they pulled themselves onto shore. Helicopter crews reported no sign of movement from above, not even a piece of fabric snagged in the trees that lined the water. Volunteers staggered back to their trucks at nightfall, their boots caked in mud, their faces hollow. The sheriff organized briefings twice daily, but the reports were always the same: no sign, no progress. Behind closed doors, investigators began to argue about whether they were looking in the right place at all. Rumors filled the void left by facts. Some residents speculated Daniel had been pulled into a hidden sinkhole beneath the crossing, a natural trap that could keep a body pinned indefinitely. Others whispered about whirlpools and undertows, claiming the river had long been cursed, taking lives without leaving evidence. But another, darker theory also emerged, that Daniel hadn't drowned at all. Some wondered aloud if he had chosen that moment to run away, using the river crossing as a cover for disappearing into the woods. A few parents pointed fingers toward the group of boys who had been with him, their shifting accounts fueling suspicions that something more sinister had unfolded on the bank that day. Meanwhile, Daniel's family spiraled into despair. His mother, refusing to leave the shoreline, wept openly as strangers placed comforting hands on her shoulders. His father stood rigid and silent, staring at the current as though memorizing every ripple, unwilling to accept that it could conceal so much. Their home, once filled with noise from 4 children, became suffocatingly quiet. His younger siblings asked questions no one could answer, their voices echoing through the house while casseroles from well-meaning neighbors went untouched. 2 weeks into the search, the operation was officially scaled back. Deputies cited the lack of evidence, the immense resources already spent, and the growing impossibility of survival. The river was declared the likely culprit, its currents too unpredictable to allow closure. For the people of Millhaven, the decision stung like betrayal. They had watched the town rally, watched hundreds of hands dig and drag for days. And still, the boy's body had never surfaced. Without proof, the case slipped from a rescue into a mystery. When the sheriff announced the suspension of active searches, the crowd of parents gathered at the town hall erupted in frustration. Voices shouted questions he couldn't answer. How could a child vanish in shallow water, in broad daylight with no trace? Was the investigation thorough, or were officials hiding something? Anger mingled with grief, creating a wound that would not close. For Daniel's family, it was unbearable. His mother accused authorities of giving up too soon, while his father withdrew further into silence, refusing to leave the house except to stand again at the river's edge. In the months that followed, the river returned to its steady flow, deceptively calm, carrying fishermen in their boats and reflecting the seasons as though nothing had happened. But for Millhaven, it was no longer just water. It was a reminder of a boy who had stepped in and never come back out. With no body, no belongings, and no resolution, Daniel's disappearance left behind only speculation. And while officials filed the case under probable drowning, the town carried its own unease, haunted by the question that no one could silence. If he drowned, why was he never found? That question would linger like an echo in the valley, pressing on everyone who had watched the search unravel, and it would ensure that Daniel Porter's name was never forgotten. In the absence of evidence, imagination took over. Weeks had passed since Daniel Porter vanished into the river, and still the water refused to give him back. Without a body, without clothing or even a scrap of belonging, Millhaven's residents found themselves building stories to fill the silence. One of the most common theories was the simplest. Daniel had slipped into a deep channel and been carried far downstream. Locals pointed out how the current could be deceptively strong in spring, how a sudden drop-off beneath the surface might have pulled him under before anyone could react. It was the explanation that fit most neatly with the scene described by the boys who had been there. But if that was true, why hadn't his body surfaced weeks later, as most drowning victims eventually did? The longer the river stayed silent, the less certain even the experts seemed to be. Another theory began to gain traction, one that suggested Daniel hadn't drowned at all. Some whispered that he had staged his disappearance, that he had used the crossing as cover to slip away into the woods on the far bank and vanish into the unknown. Rumors swirled about a troubled home life, arguments overheard between his parents, a boy who might have felt trapped in a small town with nowhere to go. For some, it was easier to believe he had chosen to leave than to accept that he had been swallowed by the river without a trace. The sheriff's department even looked into the possibility, pulling phone records, speaking with extended family in neighboring towns, and canvassing bus stations to see if anyone matching Daniel's description had passed through. Nothing surfaced, yet the idea of a runaway took root in the community, dividing those who clung to it from those who found it unthinkable. In school hallways, the whispers grew darker. Some classmates claimed Daniel had talked about leaving long before that day, that he had drawn maps of where he would go, though no such evidence was ever found in his room. Others speculated he hadn't left by choice at all, that someone had been waiting for him on the other side of the river. Parents grew uneasy hearing children repeat stories of a stranger in a truck seen near the woods, or of someone luring kids with candy at the general store weeks before. None of it was confirmed, but the fear lingered. What if Daniel hadn't drowned or run away? What if he had been taken? The very possibility made families in Millhaven keep their children closer. Curfews came earlier, and a quiet suspicion settled over the town. For investigators, the theories complicated every step. Without physical evidence, they were forced to chase down each rumor, no matter how improbable. Deputies knocked on doors across county lines, spoke to known offenders in the area, and even reviewed cases of missing children from other states to see if there was a pattern. Each lead ended in a dead end, leaving the case file thicker, but no clearer. Meanwhile, Daniel's parents clung fiercely to the hope that he was still alive. His mother refused to accept the drowning theory, convinced that if no body had been found, her son had to be out there somewhere. She kept his room intact, clothes folded neatly in drawers, bed made each morning, as if ready for him to walk back through the door at any moment. His father, though quieter, pored over maps of the river, tracking currents and depths, insisting to anyone who would listen that something about the story didn't add up. As the months passed, the lack of resolution fractured the community. Some neighbors criticized the Porters for holding on to false hope, arguing it only deepened their pain. Others supported them, believing that hope was the only thing that kept them standing. Tensions flared during community meetings, where parents demanded answers from the sheriff's office. Accusations were thrown. Some claimed the investigation had been mishandled. Others accused the boys who had been with Daniel of hiding something. Their stories had never aligned perfectly, and the inconsistencies kept fueling suspicion. But every time investigators pressed them, the boys insisted it had been nothing more than an accident, their voices breaking under the weight of the questions. Behind closed doors, Millhaven's families began to speculate about one another. Whose father had a criminal record? Who had unexplained scratches the day after Daniel vanished? Who had seemed too quiet, too eager to move on? These conversations, whispered in kitchens and on porches, began to corrode the trust that had once defined the town. The tragedy was no longer just about a boy lost to the river. It was about a community unraveling under the pressure of not knowing. Through it all, Daniel's absence remained the only certainty. His face, printed on fading flyers, stared back from bulletin boards long after most people stopped looking. His mother's eyes grew hollow with exhaustion, while his father seemed to age decades in a single year. Birthdays passed with an empty chair at the table, Christmas mornings with unopened gifts. For the Porters, hope was both salvation and torment. It kept them alive, but it also kept the wound open. They would not give up searching, even as the town around them grew restless, whispering theories that shifted like shadows. By the first anniversary of his disappearance, the story had cemented itself as Millhaven's central mystery. To outsiders, it was another missing child case. To those who lived there, it was a haunting puzzle with too many possible answers and no proof to support any of them. Some swore Daniel had been swept far away by the river. Others believed he had chosen to vanish. A few clung to the fear that someone in their midst had taken him. And as these theories battled for dominance, one truth remained. None of them could explain why not a single trace of Daniel Porter had ever been found. That absence, more than anything, left the town restless. And it was only a matter of time before suspicion would shift from speculation to something far more personal. The longer the investigation dragged on without evidence, the more investigators focused on the only witnesses who had actually been there, the boys who had gone to the river with Daniel. At first, their accounts seemed straightforward. They all agreed Daniel had entered the water ahead of them, that he was moving quickly, eager to reach the far bank before anyone else. But when deputies pressed for details, their stories began to unravel. One boy swore he saw Daniel stumble and slip beneath the current. Another claimed Daniel was walking confidently, turned to look back, and then was simply gone. A third insisted Daniel had made it close to the far side before disappearing altogether. None of it aligned. Each retelling seemed to shift slightly, as though the details were being adjusted, consciously or not, to deflect suspicion. Detectives recognized the pattern. Children could easily become confused in moments of panic, their memories muddled by fear and shock. But the inconsistencies also raised darker possibilities, that someone among them was deliberately hiding the truth. In a town where trust had once been automatic, those inconsistencies began to spread like cracks through glass. Deputies visited each boy's home, speaking with parents late into the night, asking about timelines, alibis, and relationships. Parents defended their children fiercely, reminding authorities they were all good kids from good families. Yet officers noted subtle unease: a father answering before his son could, a mother holding her child's hand tightly as if to keep him from saying the wrong thing. The boys themselves grew restless under the weight of suspicion. At school, teachers reported them withdrawn, distracted, often staring at the floor during lessons. Some were bullied by classmates who accused them outright of knowing more than they admitted. Others avoided the topic completely, shrinking away whenever Daniel's name was mentioned. Each police interview only deepened the sense that they were being treated as suspects rather than traumatized witnesses. But in the absence of a body, investigators had little else to work with. In private, the sheriff's team examined every possibility. Could the boys have been roughhousing that day, a childish scuffle at the water's edge escalating into something deadly? Could Daniel have been pushed, struck, or held under? If so, why didn't anyone confess? Why had no one tried to pull him out? And if foul play had occurred, why had no trace of it been found? No torn clothing, no marks along the riverbank, no witnesses beyond the group itself. The silence around the case only amplified the suspicion. Search warrants were quietly issued. Officers entered the boys' homes, searching their rooms for anything unusual: blood-stained clothing, secret notes, anything that might suggest guilt or premeditation. They found nothing beyond the ordinary clutter of childhood: video games, baseball gloves, half-finished homework assignments. Their parents' accounts of the day were consistent with what the boys had told them. None of them had left town. None of them had been unaccounted for long enough to carry out something more elaborate. But absence of evidence did not clear them. Instead, it left the case trapped in a space between possibility and proof. As weeks passed, the whispers in Millhaven grew harsher. Neighbors exchanged looks in the grocery store, conversations lowering to a hush when the boys' families walked by. Parents who had once trusted their children to roam freely now questioned whether violence could exist so close to home. The boys, once inseparable friends, began to drift apart, each family pulling their child tighter, protecting them from both investigators and gossip. The bonds that had tied the community together frayed visibly. For Daniel's family, the focus on the boys provided little comfort. His mother wanted answers, and the shifting stories seemed to confirm her darkest fears, that someone knew more than they were saying. She demanded the sheriff push harder, press longer, break through the walls of silence. His father, though less vocal, harbored his own suspicions. He began spending long hours near the crossing, watching the water, replaying what he imagined had happened that day. He believed someone was holding the missing piece, and he could not let it go. By the end of the summer, with no body and no confession, the official stance of the sheriff's office was cautious. The boys were no longer treated as active suspects, but their names were never cleared either. They remained suspended in a gray zone, not guilty, but not entirely innocent in the eyes of their neighbors. The investigation stalled, weighed down by rumor and uncertainty. What had begun as a rescue effort had devolved into an atmosphere of mistrust, where every glance carried accusation and every silence suggested guilt. Though the sheriff announced publicly that the case was still open, privately many investigators admitted they had reached a wall. Without Daniel's body, they had nothing to confirm foul play and nothing to rule it out. The unanswered questions hardened into a permanent shadow over the town. People stopped asking whether Daniel drowned or ran away. They began to ask instead who among their children might have carried a secret for far too long. And that question, whispered in kitchens and church pews, ensured the suspicion would not fade but grow heavier with time, waiting for the day the river would finally give up its truth. As the seasons changed and years slipped quietly past, the Porter family was left frozen in the shadow of one afternoon they could never escape. In the beginning, they held themselves together through sheer force of will, clinging to the routines of daily life as if keeping the household running might somehow keep Daniel alive. His mother cooked dinner at the same hour each evening, setting one extra plate at the table, though she knew it would remain untouched. His father continued his job at the mill, rising before dawn and returning late, his silence heavier with each passing day. For a while they managed to give the appearance of a family still functioning, but beneath the surface, grief had already begun to erode them. As weeks turned into months, the differences in how they carried that grief drove them further apart. Daniel's mother could not bear the stares of neighbors or the whispers she overheard in town, whispers that alternated between sympathy and speculation. To her, every corner of Millhaven became suffocating, haunted by the memory of what had been lost. Less than 2 years after her son's disappearance, she packed her belongings and left the town entirely, settling in another county where no one knew her story. Some said she abandoned her family. Others said she had no choice if she hoped to survive. Her departure fractured what little stability remained. Daniel's father, by contrast, rooted himself even deeper in place. He stopped going to church, stopped attending community gatherings, and rarely spoke more than a few words to anyone. He became a fixture at the riverbank, standing for hours at the very crossing where his son had last been seen. Some days he carried a fishing pole, not to fish, but to have an excuse to linger. Other days he sat in silence, staring at the current, as though waiting for it to finally release its secret. Over time, his presence there became so constant that people avoided the crossing altogether, unwilling to confront the sight of a man locked in unending vigil. For Daniel's siblings, life became a different kind of burden. They were children when their brother disappeared, too young to understand the full weight of the tragedy, but old enough to feel its ripple in every aspect of their lives. At school, they carried the invisible label of being the Porter kids, the ones whose brother had vanished. Teachers showed them leniency, classmates gave them pity, but nothing filled the absence. They grew up in the shadow of a boy whose image remained frozen at 13, smiling out from fading photographs pinned to the refrigerator and framed in the hallway. Each milestone they reached, graduations, first jobs, marriages, was accompanied by an unspoken comparison to the brother who should have been there alongside them. The case itself turned cold within a few years. Files were thinned out and tucked into a cabinet at the sheriff's office, checked only when a new deputy asked about the town's greatest unsolved mystery. The photographs taken during the search began to yellow at the edges. Daniel's face on missing posters faded by time and sunlight. New crimes demanded attention, new families required answers, and the disappearance of a boy with no body and no trace gradually became less of an investigation and more of a local legend. The town told the story of Daniel Porter the way it told stories of floods or fires, an event etched into its history, but no longer actively fought against. Yet the memory never loosened its hold completely. Every spring, as the anniversary approached, townsfolk gathered quietly at the riverbank to lay flowers or light candles. It was less a formal vigil and more an unspoken ritual, an acknowledgement that the town still carried its guilt and sorrow. Children who hadn't even been born when Daniel vanished grew up knowing his name, warned by their parents never to cross the river without supervision. The crossing itself became a place of superstition, avoided by many, spoken of in hushed tones as if the water itself was cursed. For the Porters, those anniversaries were unbearable reminders. His father, grayer and more hollow with each year, often refused to attend, choosing instead to visit the site alone at dawn or dusk when no one else was around. His siblings, now adults, sometimes returned but rarely stayed long, the weight of expectation too much to bear. His mother never came back at all. To those who remained in Millhaven, the absence of the family at these gatherings was almost as painful as the absence of Daniel himself. The years stretched on, and life moved forward for everyone else. Children grew into adults, the town expanded in small ways, businesses opened and closed. But for those closest to the tragedy, time had stood still. Daniel remained 13 forever, the boy who never crossed the river, the boy whose story ended without explanation. His absence became heavier with each passing year, not lighter, because the silence around it had calcified into permanence. The river had given nothing back, and the wound it opened never healed. Still, beneath the resignation lingered an unshakable question. What had really happened that day? Was it a tragic accident, a runaway gone wrong, or something darker left unspoken by those who were there? The lack of resolution kept the story alive, festering in whispers, gnawing at the edges of memory. And though the case was officially abandoned, the truth remained buried somewhere, whether in the current, in the silence of frightened boys turned men, or in the shadows of the town itself. That lingering uncertainty, that inability to close the chapter, would ensure that when the river finally revealed what it had kept hidden, it would shake Mill Haven all over again. The summer of the 20th year, after Daniel Porter vanished, began with little warning. A brutal heat wave swept through the valley, drying up creeks and shrinking ponds until their muddy beds cracked open under the sun. For Mill Haven, the river had always been steady, even in droughts, its wide body of water feeding farms and cooling the town through generations. But that summer, it receded to levels not seen in living memory. The current slowed to a sluggish crawl, exposing long-buried rocks and skeletal tree trunks that had rested hidden beneath the surface for decades. For those who had lived through Daniel's disappearance, the sight stirred unease. They could not help but glance at the narrowing channel and wonder what secrets might finally be revealed. It began with rumors among fishermen. They spoke of jagged openings visible along the river's banks, places where erosion had eaten into the stone and exposed narrow cavities beneath. Word spread quickly, drawing the attention of local divers, many of whom had grown up hearing the story of the boy who vanished. Some were too young to remember the search firsthand, but all of them knew the legend. When a local diving group decided to explore the exposed sections, they were driven not only by curiosity, but also by the lingering ghost of an unanswered question. One morning in late July, two divers lowered themselves into a section of the river rarely accessible before the drought. The water was murky, choked with sediment and branches carried from upstream, but as they pushed deeper, they found a cavity carved into the riverbank. It wasn't large, just a pocket hidden behind a wall of stone and debris, but it was deep enough to create a natural trap. From the surface, no one would have guessed it existed. The divers marked the location and returned later with better lights, determined to see how far the chamber went. Their second descent revealed details more unsettling. Inside the cavity, the divers discovered layers of driftwood and trash, the kind of detritus carried by storms and lodged in place over years. Beneath that, the floor dropped suddenly, creating a shadowy pit where visibility disappeared into darkness. One diver later described the feeling as eerie, as though the river had designed a place to hide what it had taken. They emerged shaken, knowing what the site represented. The very crossing where Daniel Porter had disappeared now held a hidden space that no one in 1999 had ever searched. News of the discovery spread through Mill Haven within hours. For older residents, it felt like the river itself was stirring after 2 silent decades, hinting at the answer it had kept buried. People gathered on the banks staring at the lowered waterline, murmuring about the boy who had vanished there. Some saw it as coincidence, a natural result of drought. Others whispered that it was fate, that the time had finally come for the truth to surface. The sheriff's office, caught off guard by the sudden attention, dispatched deputies to secure the site and contacted forensic divers to investigate properly. After so many years of frustration, the possibility of resolution brought both relief and dread. For Daniel's family, scattered by grief, the news reopened wounds they had tried to close. His father, now aged and frail, returned to the crossing with a quiet determination. He stood once again at the river's edge, the same place he had haunted 2 decades earlier, and watched the water trickle past the exposed cavity. His daughters, now grown, gathered beside him, uncertain whether to feel hope or fear. They knew that if the river revealed something, it could finally end their torment, but it could also confirm the darkest suspicions that had haunted them since childhood. The following week, professional divers arrived with equipment suited for forensic recovery. Locals watched as boats anchored near the cavity, lights and cameras lowered into the murky water. Hours passed with little to report. They surfaced with descriptions of collapsed stone, jagged ledges, and piles of debris that had sealed the chamber for years. Yet their voices carried an edge of caution. The site was dangerous, unstable, and filled with silt that clouded instantly at the slightest movement. But it was clear to everyone watching that this was no ordinary hollow. It was the kind of place where something, or someone, could remain hidden, unreachable, and forgotten. As the sun set on the final day of their initial survey, one diver spoke quietly to the sheriff on the riverbank. He described what looked like remnants of fabric caught deep within the debris, material that seemed out of place among the natural clutter of logs and stone. The sheriff said little publicly, but the look on his face was enough. For the first time in 20 years, there was reason to believe that Daniel Porter had never left the river at all. That revelation swept through Millhaven with force. Conversations that had grown quiet over the years erupted again, families revisiting theories and suspicions long buried. Those who had always believed Daniel drowned felt vindicated, while others insisted the discovery only deepened the mystery. If his body had been trapped in a hidden cavity all this time, why hadn't it surfaced? And if it had remained concealed for 2 decades, what condition would it be in now? When the forensic divers returned, they came prepared for more than exploration. They carried specialized tools to sift through silt and cut away debris, cameras to capture evidence, and bags designed for human remains. The river, sluggish and low from the drought, felt like it had finally given permission to probe deeper than ever before. Locals gathered along the banks in uneasy silence, watching the activity from a distance, their conversations hushed, their children held close. Everyone in Millhaven knew what the divers were looking for, though no one wanted to be the first to say it aloud. The divers worked methodically, clearing branches and heavy stones that had collapsed over the mouth of the cavity. Clouds of sediment rose with every movement, making visibility nearly impossible. They had to retreat often, surfacing with reports of how deep and twisted the chamber was, how it narrowed before dropping into a pit that seemed deliberately hidden. Each time they went back down, the tension along the shore tightened, the crowd waiting for the moment when rumor and memory might turn into hard evidence. On the 3rd day, the breakthrough came. A diver emerged slowly, carrying something small but unmistakable, a piece of fabric, waterlogged and torn, caught among the debris. At first it looked like nothing more than a scrap of cloth, but when examined closely, it revealed stitching that matched the style of boys' jeans from the late 1990s. The sheriff accepted the evidence with a grim face, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The chamber had kept its secret for 2 decades, and now it was beginning to speak. Encouraged, the divers pressed further. Beneath layers of branches and stone, they uncovered more fragments, part of a sneaker sole, degraded but still bearing the outline of a tread. Then came the discovery no one could mistake. In the far corner of the cavity, wedged against the wall of stone, lay a bone. The diver who found it surfaced without a word, laying it gently into a forensic bag before signaling for the search to pause. The sheriff confirmed quietly to his team what everyone feared. The bone appeared human. Within minutes, the site was sealed as a crime scene. For the town, the news was devastating but magnetic. People had speculated for years about Daniel's fate, but to hear that remains had finally been found was something else entirely. Some cried openly, believing closure was at last within reach. Others whispered about what it would mean if the bone truly belonged to Daniel. Did it prove the river had swallowed him, just as many believed? Or did it suggest something darker, that he had been left there deliberately, hidden in a place no one was meant to find? The Porter family was notified immediately. Daniel's sisters, now adults with families of their own, returned to Millhaven for the first time in years. They stood together near the riverbank, faces pale, watching the divers continue their grim work. Their father sat quietly in a chair brought down to the shore, hands folded tightly, his eyes fixed on the water. He had spent years insisting his son had never left this place, and now the river itself seemed to confirm it. But confirmation was not the same as understanding. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. By the end of the week, divers had recovered several bones, fragments of clothing, and small personal items too degraded to identify on site. Everything was sealed and rushed to a state forensic lab for analysis. The sheriff held a brief press conference, his words cautious, promising only that investigators would pursue the truth wherever the evidence led. Behind him, deputies stood with solemn faces, knowing they were stepping into a case long thought dormant, a case that had haunted the town's conscience for 20 years. That night, Millhaven buzzed with speculation. Families gathered at kitchen tables, rehashing theories that had lain dormant for decades. Some insisted this proved Daniel had simply drowned, his body trapped in an impossible-to-reach pocket of the river. Others pointed to the unnatural concealment of the cavity and argued it was no accident. To them, the discovery confirmed what many had whispered since the beginning. Someone knew what happened to Daniel Porter, and someone had spent 20 years in silence. The questions pressed heavier with each passing day. What story would the bones tell? Would they confirm a drowning or reveal violence? Forensic answers would take weeks, but the river had already reignited a mystery that had never truly faded. And for the first time since Daniel vanished, it seemed the truth was closer than ever, waiting to be unearthed from the silence where it had been hidden all along. The evidence recovered from the river was delivered to the state forensic laboratory with the kind of urgency reserved for high-profile cases. For Millhaven, it felt as though time had rewound. 20 years after Daniel Porter vanished, the town found itself waiting again for answers from experts, the same way it had in the days after the disappearance. But this time, there was no hope of a rescue. This time, the hope was for the truth. The lab began with the clothing fragments. Fibers were compared against photographs of what Daniel had been wearing that spring afternoon: denim jeans, a striped t-shirt, a pair of sneakers with distinctive blue trim. The material pulled from the cavity, though degraded, matched. The stitching patterns, the fabric type, even the faint remains of dye were consistent with late 1990s children's clothing. A sneaker sole fragment recovered from the chamber was even more telling. Despite 2 decades in the water, the tread design aligned with a brand Daniel's parents confirmed they had bought for him just weeks before he disappeared. To the investigators, it was the first strong link tying the remains to the boy who had haunted their files for so long. But the bones carried the most weight. Forensic anthropologists examined them carefully, cataloging each fragment, testing for preservation and age. DNA extraction was attempted, despite the challenges of long water exposure. Weeks later, the results came back, partial but conclusive enough. The remains belonged to Daniel Porter. At last, the boy who had been spoken of in past tense for 20 years was no longer just a missing person. He had been found. Yet discovery brought no peace. Analysis of the skull fragments revealed something unexpected: blunt force trauma to the back of the head. The fracture pattern was not consistent with a simple fall into shallow water or being battered by rocks in a current. Instead, the injury suggested a violent blow delivered before or during his disappearance. While the condition of the remains made precise determination difficult, the forensic team grew confident enough to rule drowning as an unlikely sole cause of death. Daniel had suffered an injury that could not be ignored. When the sheriff's office released this information, Millhaven erupted in disbelief and fear. For 2 decades, residents had comforted themselves with the idea that Daniel's death had been an accident, a tragedy of nature and circumstance. Now they were confronted with evidence pointing toward violence. If Daniel had not simply slipped beneath the current, then what had truly happened at the crossing that day? The spotlight turned sharply back to the boys who had been with him. They were no longer children, but grown men, many with jobs, marriages, and families of their own. And suddenly, they were once again suspects. Detectives reopened interviews, approaching the men cautiously but firmly. The inconsistencies in their original statements, dismissed years earlier as the confusion of frightened kids, now carried a more sinister weight. One had said Daniel slipped, another said he simply vanished, another claimed he had nearly reached the far side, Their stories had never lined up, and with the discovery of trauma to Daniel's skull, those contradictions felt less like confusion and more like concealment. Each man insisted he had told the truth back then, that he remembered little more than panic and splashing water. But detectives pressed harder this time, reminding them that science had filled in gaps their stories had failed to explain. The town divided quickly. Some residents defended the men, saying they had carried the burden of suspicion unfairly for years and should not be condemned without proof. Others whispered that the truth had always been obvious, that one or more of those boys had struck Daniel and hidden behind silence. Families once bound by shared grief now eyed each other with suspicion, old friendships shattered by accusation. For Daniel's surviving family, the developments were devastating. His father, now frail, could not shake the belief that the truth had been there all along, that someone in town had watched him grieve while knowing more than they admitted. His sisters, grown into adults, carried both relief that their brother was no longer missing and fury that closure had come with the shadow of violence. Behind closed doors, investigators reconstructed the possibilities. Could Daniel have been struck during a fight, whether intentional or accidental? Could the blow have come from something else? An object thrown, a rock in the shallows, a panicked shove gone too far? Each scenario led back to the same chilling conclusion. Someone knew. The river had preserved the evidence long enough to prove Daniel hadn't simply drowned, but it could not say how or why or at whose hands. Those answers would have to come from people, not water. In the weeks that followed, deputies revisited old notes, searching for discrepancies they had overlooked in 1999. Interviews were cross-referenced, timelines scrutinized, alibis tested again. The case, once written off as a mystery of nature, now looked increasingly like a human secret carried in silence for 2 decades. And though no arrests were made, the pressure grew unbearable for those who had once been Daniel's friends. The town watched them closely, waiting to see who might crack first. For the Porters, the revelations deepened their torment. The discovery of remains had promised closure, but instead it opened new wounds. Their son and brother had not simply been taken by the current. He had been struck, injured, and hidden in a cavity the river concealed for years. They had mourned an accident, but now they were forced to confront the possibility of betrayal. Each anniversary that had passed with flowers laid by the water now felt tainted, shadowed by the knowledge that someone may have watched them suffer while knowing exactly what had happened. The current of the river flowed on as it always had, indifferent, steady, carrying away only fragments of what it once held. But now Millhaven knew that beneath its surface, for all those years, the truth had waited. Truth that was darker and far more complicated than anyone had been willing to believe. And with that truth came a new chapter in the story, one that would demand not just remembrance, but reckoning. The discovery of Daniel Porter's remains and the revelation of trauma on his skull set in motion a chain of pressure no one in Millhaven could escape. Investigators turned their focus back to the only living witnesses of that day, the boys who had been with him at the river crossing. They were no longer frightened children, but grown men, most in their 30s now, carrying the weight of families, jobs, and reputations. But when deputies called them in for interviews, the same nervous tics resurfaced, the same halting voices and inconsistent details. The difference was that time had hardened those contradictions into suspicion too heavy to ignore. For weeks, the sheriff's department pushed, circling back on the smallest inconsistencies. They replayed old statements, compared transcripts, and reminded each man that the truth was closing in whether he chose to speak it or not. Some responded with anger, slamming their hands on tables and demanding the town stop painting them as villains. Others broke into quiet tears, worn down by the knowledge that their silence had carried for 2 decades. What once might have been dismissed as childhood panic now looked increasingly like a pact, a secret guarded fiercely against the march of time. The breakthrough came not in a dramatic confession under harsh lights, but in a quiet moment of collapse. One of the men, who had been 13 years old the day Daniel disappeared, agreed to meet with investigators again, this time without an attorney or family present. His voice cracked as he began to speak, his words halting at first, then spilling out as though the dam of silence had finally broken. He described what really happened at the riverbank that afternoon, a truth darker and more mundane than any theory the town had spun. The boy, restless and competitive, had been roughhousing near the crossing. Daniel, always energetic, had teased the others, daring them to keep up as he waded into the current. Tempers flared, insults traded, and in a moment of frustration, one of the boys shoved him. It wasn't meant to kill, he insisted, just a push, the kind of thing children did to each other 100 times before. But Daniel stumbled backward, his head striking a jagged rock near the shallow edge with a sickening sound. He collapsed instantly, motionless, blood clouding the water. The boys froze, horror replacing bravado, realizing what they had done. Panic overtook them. They tried shaking him, pulling at his arms, but Daniel did not respond. The current tugged at his body, drawing him toward the deeper middle channel. Terrified and certain no adult would believe it was an accident, the boys made a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They let the current carry Daniel into the cavity beneath the riverbank, watching as his body lodged in the hidden pocket. They swore to each other they would never tell, convincing themselves that the river had swallowed him whole, that silence was the only way to escape punishment. The man who confessed wept as he recounted those moments, describing the pact made in fear and desperation. They told their parents only fragments of the truth, crafting stories of slips and sudden vanishings that investigators had puzzled over ever since. And as days turned into weeks and weeks into years, the lie hardened into their reality. Each boy carried it into adulthood, burying it beneath the milestones of life, yet never escaping the memory of Daniel's body disappearing into the dark water. When this confession reached the sheriff, it brought both clarity and devastation. The details matched the forensic evidence, the blow to the skull, the position of the remains, the absence of signs of a struggle beyond the injury. It was not murder in the sense of premeditation, but it was no accident of nature either. It was a fatal moment of childhood recklessness compounded by a lifetime of silence. The town's reaction was divided. Some saw the confession as cowardice, proof that the men had hidden behind lies while an entire community suffered. Others, though furious, recognized the complexity of children making a panicked choice they could never undo. But no one was left untouched. Neighbors who had once offered casseroles in sympathy to the Porter family now wrestled with the knowledge that justice had been within reach all along, stolen by silence. For Daniel's family, the truth landed like a cruel paradox. They had begged for answers for 20 years, and now they had them. Their son had not run away, had not been stolen by a stranger, had not disappeared into some supernatural void. He had been the victim of a shove, a rock, and a lie. His mother, long gone from Millhaven, received the news with bitter grief. His sisters, now. Groan, said closure, was a word too hollow to describe what they felt. And his father, who had spent countless hours at the river's edge, was left staring at the same current, knowing the truth had always been there, just hidden in silence and stone. The sheriff's office filed no charges. The statute of limitations for manslaughter committed by juveniles had long expired, and the legal system could not punish men for what they had done as boys. The only sentence left was the one they had already been serving, 2 decades of carrying a secret that hollowed them out from the inside. The town of Millhaven, though, was changed forever. The river crossing, once a place of childhood adventure, became a memorial, a reminder of how quickly innocence could turn into tragedy. And as the news spread, the story of Daniel Porter was no longer a mystery, no longer a legend. It was the story of a boy lost to a moment of anger, a hidden cavity in the river, and the unbearable weight of silence. For 20 years, the story of Daniel Porter had been a wound that never closed. Parents warned their children about the river, friends whispered about the day he vanished, and his family lived under the crushing weight of absence. But when the truth finally emerged, when the remains were recovered, the forensic evidence analyzed, and the long-kept secret confessed, the town of Mill Haven was forced to face what it had tried to bury. Daniel's death had not been an unsolvable mystery of nature. It had been the result of a shove, a head-striking stone, and a silence that stretched for decades. The confession reshaped everything. The image of the river as a greedy, merciless force gave way to a harsher reality. It had not claimed Daniel on its own. Human hands had played a role, however unintentional, and human voices had chosen to stay quiet. The men who once were boys carried that knowledge into adulthood, building lives around a lie. When their secret was exposed, the community looked at them with a mixture of anger, pity, and betrayal. They had been victims of their own childhood fear, but they had also allowed an entire town to suffer in uncertainty for 20 years. Daniel's family gathered again at the river crossing, but this time it was not to search or speculate. It was to finally bring him home. A small service was held on the bank, the water running low from the drought, the cavity where he had been found now visible to all. His sisters stood close together, holding one another as his remains were placed in a casket, the closure they had begged for finally delivered, though at a cost they could hardly bear. His father, weathered and gray, spoke only a few words, his voice breaking as he admitted that the vigil he had kept for so long was over. The boy he had waited for would never return, but he was no longer missing. The town turned the service into a collective reckoning. Flowers were laid along the shoreline, and candles flickered in the twilight, casting light across the water. People who had once avoided speaking Daniel's name now said it aloud, their voices carried by the current. There was relief in finally knowing, but also outrage at the years of silence. Mill Haven had mourned a mystery when it could have mourned a child. That betrayal would not be easily forgiven. For the men who confessed, there was no legal consequence. The law could not reach that far back, but their punishment was measured in other ways. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. Old friends cut ties. Their families bore the weight of whispered judgment. They had been boys when it happened, but they were men when they kept the truth hidden. The town's anger was not only for the shove that killed Daniel, but for the silence that followed. As the weeks passed, the river returned to its normal flow, the drought easing, the water rising to conceal once more the cavity that had held its secret. But it no longer seemed like a place of mystery. Instead, it was a grave, a reminder that the truth could be delayed but never erased. The Porter family buried Daniel in the town cemetery, his grave marked beside those of his grandparents. For the first time in 2 decades, they had a place to go that was not the riverbank, a place where their grief could finally rest. Yet the legacy of Daniel's disappearance lingered. His story became a warning told to children, not about the dangers of water, but about the dangers of silence. His sisters spoke publicly about what had been revealed, urging honesty even in fear, saying that secrets can destroy lives as much as accidents can. The community, once fractured by rumor, found unity in a shared vow to remember. But the memory carried a bitterness that would never fully fade. In the end, the river had kept its promise. It had hidden Daniel for 20 years, guarding the truth in a place no one could reach. But when the water receded, when the drought peeled back the layers of stone and debris, it revealed what had been concealed. The secret was no longer held by the current, but by the people who had lived with it. And once it surfaced, nothing could push it back beneath the surface again. For Mill Haven, closure was not the healing of a wound, but the acceptance of a scar. Daniel Porter had never returned from the river crossing, but his story had. It returned in fragments of fabric, in bone, in confession. It returned in the grief of his family and the guilt of his friends. And as the town stood at the water's edge, watching the current flow steadily past, they understood what the river had always been, a keeper, not a thief, holding its truth until time forced it into the light.